Hey everyone, I'm Hashi, and this is Cheap Tricks. Since the dawn of film, there have been some really cool title sequences. I love these opening and closing bookends because they really showcase some visual creativity. The artists who put them together often have a little bit more freedom to experiment with new techniques. Older film titles showed off the forefront of film compositing and animation techniques, with a lot of practical elements mixed in, and naturally, as we move forward in time, we see more digital techniques being explored by some of these really amazing filmmakers. A little while ago, I got to see Marvel's Black Panther, and so did a lot of other people. Like, a lot of other people. That means that a lot of people got to see its awesome intro sequence, and also this amazing end credit sequence set to a song that I can't possibly afford to license for this, but it all centers around Wakandan vibranium sand. This month I'm going to show you how to pull off the look of some of these vibranium sand sculptures. First, we're going to take a crack at it using no third-party plugins at all. And then we're going to really dive in and try to pull it off using Trapcode Form. We'll also try to riff on some of these new skills along the way to create something different if possible. Now we're covering a lot of ground, but you can always use the table of contents below to quickly navigate any of these Cheap Tricks episodes. Before we begin, a little bit of research on Wakanda technology is in order. Now, Wakanda's really secretive and really difficult to get a hold of, but I've got something even better.
Jeremy Lasky, co-founder and partner at Perception.
I'm Danny Gonzalez. I'm co-founder and partner at Perception.
I'm John Lepore. I'm the Chief Creative Director.
I'm Russ Gauthier. I'm the Art Director here at Perception.
Perception is a New York-based design firm that specializes in future tech. HUDs and GUIs and OMGs. Since 2009, their partnership with Marvel Studios has made their visuals some of the most iconic and memorable of the last decade. I asked them how they first came to work with Marvel Studios.
Well, it wasn't overnight, I can tell you that. It was a dream client that we both had wanted to work with and for from the very beginning when we started Perception. And there was no silver bullet. It really just took persistence and tenacity.
Well, something you should know is that Jeremy's from Brooklyn, I'm from Queens, so that never say die attitude from New York. They saw the passion and they saw the knowledge that we had for the characters as well.
We're always really eager to, stretch our legs and try some new things. And we're really fortunate because when we work with Marvel, they take technology and the way it's represented in these films really seriously. Working on Black Panther, it was a really unique opportunity to think about technology from the perspective of a culture that's never seen healthy Obi-Wan Kenobi, right?
It was so far in the past that Obi-Wan Kenobi was even a thought yet. One of the things that we really thought a lot about was something very physical, something very tactile, something that felt like you could pick it up and touch it and manipulate it, sand or clay or water or any of these, very physical things that you have readily available to you. And then, of course, fueling that with vibranium.
Vibranium just makes everything better.
It does.
Wakanda is so much about this material, this element, vibranium, which is this metallic particular substance that we were able to use to generate these holograms, and then, of course, to generate the main on-end title sequence. So it all flows together from the same DNA of the film.
It's an infinitely malleable substance that you can use for anything, and you can create any potential interface out of that.
The main on-end title sequence was literally the last thing we did in what was an 18-month process working on the film. But this concept of vibranium sand being actuated by ultrasonic sound waves and whatnot, and sound waves because vibranium, right? That all came from literally our very first discussion or our very first presentation that we had to director Ryan Coogler and the rest of the Marvel Studios executive team.
It's been an honor and a real privilege for us to be part of that inner circle.
I figured if we're going to try to pull off a version of their amazing work using Form in particular, I should ask if they've ever used the tools.
We did some stuff in our very first sort of proof of concept test, sand simulations using Form, I think it was.
It's a lovely tool.
We
particular was something we used quite a bit.
I used it all the time. Yep. I was very particular with my particular.
We'll look forward to seeing what you come up with.
I had an amazing time talking to these artists from Perception. They've got a really great story, and if you'd like to learn more, you should definitely check out their channel and enjoy some of their epic breakdowns and behind-the-scenes material. But for now, let's dive into the sand. Now, my whole goal with this series is not to just teach you guys one specific effect each month. I really want you to gain a skill set in our time together, and hopefully give you the confidence to try out something you've never tried before. Now, last time a few of you said that I moved a little bit too quickly, so I'm going to try to just breathe a little without making this 7 hours long. If you guys have any questions, please ask them below. I try to keep tabs on the comments. Also, you can ask me on Twitter, and I'll probably get you an answer to your question pretty quickly. In any case, let me be a resource to you. And if you see a question you know the answer to, be a resource to others. Let's help each other out. Speaking of which, whenever possible, I'm going to try to share a whole bunch of files and templates with you just to get you started. Like this one for Wakandan text. It's a simple template for translating credits from Wakandan to Roman characters. The nifty part is, all you have to do is change the comp name. Title, dash, name, and the comp will do its thing. Please check out the links below for that and samples of everything else I'm going to be talking about today. Oh, and did I not mention that this is all Adobe After Effects last time? I'm using Adobe After Effects. It says it at the top of the screen for like 90% of Alright, let's take a minute to think about what sand is like.
It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
How about a checklist instead? The key features of these shots seem to be a colorful background gradient, an awesome-looking figure or landscape, a surface that looks like sand. Its surface is speckled with particles, there are little glints scattered throughout, it has clear directional lighting, and perhaps a nice rim light. The movement in a lot of these shots comes from the camera. And lastly, we've got some really cool extras going on as well. Vibrations and sound input, imperfections, scattering, wind effects. All of these coming together can probably produce some really pretty images. And just going back to Indiana Jones for a second, does Belloc shout out Wakanda to the natives? Wakanda Matuso! Alright. First up, let's see how far we can get just using After Effects procedurally. Organization is really important for procedural effects, so let's create 3 comps right at the beginning. I'm going to do HD 24 frames per second, make sure I have enough time to play with. Let's call this first one 01 source, and then let's make 2 more, and we'll call them 02 sandify and 03 result. We can start in comp 03. Now looking at that checklist from before, let's create some sand sculptures. Alright, colorful backgrounds, no problem. Let's create a new solid, make sure it's the comp size, and let's call it BG. That's industry lingo for Barry Gibbs. Now, I used to use linear and radial ramps a lot, but recently, the 4-color gradient has been my jam. I once thought, like, who would ever use that? But turns out that I would. It's just a little more interesting than a straight-up ramp. And it can look really nice if you keep everything in a more simple color palette. And dial up the blend and the jitter. Now, these exact colors don't really matter because of something we're going to do later. When we're happy in here, let's pop over to our Comp 1 source. In here, we need something with good cinematic lighting. I'll temp up a sphere using a gray solid and CC sphere for now. In here, I can set the radius, adjust the lighting settings, and even play a little bit with the surface options for how the light is taken up by this sphere. Then I'm going to add an effect called CC Light Sweep. Now this is a total cheeseball effect to add a little glint to titles or logos, but I use it because it can help simulate a really controlled rim light. I turn down the sweep intensity and turn up the edge intensity and width. It's a 2D effect, but I'm going to make a lot of use of it today. Alright, great. Now let's place our Comp 1 into Comp 2. Here we're going to convert this ball to something that looks more like sand. First up, let's add some roughen edges. The key here is to have the scale really low, the sharpness a little bit higher, and the edge width not too thick, at least for now. Now, one problem with an effect like roughen edges is that if your layer touches the edge of the screen, like this, the edge of your screen is getting eroded too. There are many effects like glows and blurs that have this edge problem, and since many of them don't feature a repeat edge pixels option, here's a great fix. CC Reptile. Apply an instance of this with a few hundred pixels set to unfold or slide, and place it above the problem effect in your effect stack. And voila, no more edge woes. Alright, just going to recenter everything and then back to Comp 2. Let's create a solid and place it under our source layer. I'll rename the solid Texture. Add the fractal noise effect to it. Set the fractal type to terrain. Crank up the contrast to 150 and the scale down to 1. Now turn off this layer, we don't need to see it. Add a second copy of the source layer on top of everything, and add our good old friend from 1992, Texturize. So this will emboss a texture onto our ball. So as the texture layer, select the texture solid and make sure Effects and Masks is selected. Change the light direction to match the general direction of your source image, and then adjust the contrast level to somewhere near 0.5. Now add the effect CC Ball Action to the layer. Set scatter at 1, grid spacing to 0. And now we're looking kind of sandy, so let's add in those glints. Alright, so duplicate this layer, and you can go ahead and delete the texturize effect. Turn the grid spacing and ball size to 8, and turn the scatter to around 20. Add auto contrast, which will punch up the values nicely. And then down here in the layer stack, change the blending mode to screen. You might need to click on this button first, or press F4 to toggle between switches and modes. So select screen, and then come down here and enable the track matte. That'll eliminate any of the particles outside of your original alpha. So these glints are neat, and they really help complete that sand look. Let's add some glow to them. Set the threshold high, like 90%, and the glow radius to 5. And up the intensity a bit. Looking good. Now on top of everything, let's add an adjustment layer, and then throw in another instance of CC Light Sweep. I'll change the width to much higher, turn the sweep intensity all the way down, put the edge intensity at around 40, and maximize the edge thickness. I can position and angle this rim until it's adding the desired effect. Alright, let's throw this sandified comp into my 03 result comp. And man, do we need some better integration. Let's add an adjustment layer and add CC Toner. For the midtone, I'm going to choose a blue color for now. But remember how I said the BG colors didn't really matter earlier? Here's why. This top level toner effect allows you to set whatever color palette you'd like in here. Alright, now let's add some glow. I'll turn the dial up to around 90% again, and then turn the radius up to 25, and the intensity to about 0.5. Then let's duplicate that glow, and turn the radius up to like 250, and the intensity a little bit higher, where it looks like the object just kind of has some nice fog or light wrap around it. We're getting pretty nice now. Some controlled blurriness would really punch this thing up. Create a solid called Blur Ramp. Let's add a gradient ramp, a radial one. Then add a curves adjustment, pulling it down and so the fall off is a little bit more distinct. You got a big black area and some white fringe on the edge. Back in my gradient ramp, I'm going to turn up the ramp scatter. Now let's hide this layer. Back in our top adjustment layer, add compound blur. select the blur ramp as the blur layer and enable effects and masks. Now you should see this really cool blur up here. You can adjust this value to really whatever you want, and because the blur is controlled by the blur ramp layer, at any time you want, you can dive down into this layer and adjust the points of this ramp to really control the blur. As a last little touch, I always like to add a noise effect at like 3% to give everything a little bit of grit. Let's import a copy of that After Effects file, the Wakandan text one. And then we can drag it right in here. Pretty cool. I can even redo the text just by renaming the comp. I just need to make sure I have a dash between the title and the name. Now if I want, I can turn a couple of these layers 3D, separate them a little bit, and add a 3D camera with a couple of keyframes, just kind of moving forward and to the side, adding a little bit of parallax to this thing. That makes it a little bit more interesting, but it also makes it really apparent that the ball is pretty much just a static image of a sandy ball. One thing that would add a little bit of life to this is to jump back into the Sandify comp, and on the very top layer, you can add in a fractal noise. Move it to the top of the effects stack. Then if you up the contrast and kind of lower the brightness and set the blending mode to overlay, what you'll basically get is a fractal noise pattern blocking out some of those highlight glint parts of the ball. If I alt-click on the evolution, I can add an expression like time times 150. And now when I press play, you'll see that as that fractal cycles, it's basically highlighting different glints at different times, pretty automatically. You could also alt-click and add this same expression to the instability state of CC ball action on layer 3, and even to the evolution of the roughen edges effect on layer 4. And now if I play back, I get just a little bit of boiling surface to this thing, which makes it a little bit more alive. You can see that now when we have our camera moving around, it feels a little bit more like a natural ball of sand that's just picking up a few different highlight points. Now I really don't want to get too far into the weeds on this particular project, but if you were so inclined, within the sanded comp, you could animate all sorts of properties like the scatter on CC ball action. On this bottom layer, you could add CC scatterize and add some scatter to these particles. Some of these effects even have things like twisting and rotation, where you could move these particles around and get some kind of cool effects if you keyframe them just right over time, and they'll propagate right into your result comp. But basically, if you wanted to, you could simulate a bunch of different types of disperse effects in here. Please feel free to play with that on your own, figure out some cool stuff. Alright, now here comes the fun part of working with a procedural comp. You can throw literally anything into this source comp, and check this out. Bam! Over here in the result, we have a sandified version of what's in the source layer. And when you're searching for images for this, you definitely want to find one with a nice high contrast and some side lighting that really shows off the dimension of whatever you have. You can always adjust the curves until they look really cool in the final sand comp. And one other thing that I found useful was in the Sandify comp to go to the top ball action layer that's creating your glints, and you can adjust the spacing and scale of these glints depending on the scale of your image. Now again, because this comp is image-based and procedural, you can throw in anything you want, and check out this. You can get this really beautiful sandified look on top of any nice high contrast picture that you have. Now, the camera's supposed to do a lot of the talking in these cases, and because this is image-based, these guys are all flat. If I move the camera around, it's really apparent it's just a flat card. Now, one method to try to get around this would be to import an image sequence or something that's already animated. For instance, this beautiful CG cat on a turntable. Once I get the curves right on that, you can see that as I play through, every frame looks really cool. It looks like the sandified version of that CG cat. But there is one drawback. When we get up close, we can really see that the glints aren't really a part of the surface of that image. They don't really track with it. Even though this cat is rotating, a lot of the sandy surface is sort of staying behind and it's moving through it. And that's just a limitation of this method, 100% After Effects, of creating this kind of an image. But never fear, it's time to pull out the big guns. That's right, Trapcode Form. Now we have a lot of great things already going for us in this template. A colorful background, some nice glows, animated text, and that custom blur rig. So let's keep some of this stuff around. But now we can create a true 3D particle array. I'll add a solid, call it Form, and then we'll add the effect Form. Let's click on Forms Designer. In here, we have a real-time preview of our object, and camera controls, just like in the comp window. It's even animating as well, but for now I'll just pause it. Click on the base form block. Then up in the corner here, we'll switch from the box grid to the OBJ model. I can click on the Choose OBJ button and select from one of Form's included shapes. I'm going to go with the array, dodecahedron, because, how often do you get to say dodecahedron for work purposes? Now what we see looks like a wireframe, but if we move the camera in, we can see that it's actually thousands of particles aligned along the edges of this 3D shape. Now there are multiple ways you can arrange the particles on or in your 3D model. For this instance, I want volume. You can see that this fills the shape up with particles. So let's click on particle type. I'm going to stick with sphere particles, but turn down the particle feather. Click on the size block, and now we can set our particle size to 1, and we'll turn up the randomness to around 30. You can see that the objects become a little bit transparent, so we're going to jump back to the base form block, scroll down to the OBJ settings, and increase the particle density to about 125. Now it's important to not go crazy with your particle count, as this will slow down the process, and it really will have diminishing returns at a certain point. For the color, I'll select a kind of dark gray. Now let's move on to shading. If I click on the word, or move up here to blocks, I can see some presets for any of the properties I'm adjusting. I'll start with the heavy shadowlets, and right away you can see something kind of cool has happened. Now shadowlets aren't exactly real shading. It's more like directional self-shadowing of each particle in depth order, creating a really great illusion actually. We'll play more with it in a moment. Next up, I can add a disperse block by clicking here. I'll just set it to 1 right now, and that adds a little bit of roughness to the shape. One feature of the sand that we played with earlier was those little glints kind of spread throughout the body of the object. Now playing around I discovered a whole bunch of ways to create these. My favorite way was utilizing one of Form's newest features, multiple instances. Just like with Particular, you can create multiple instances of Form that all share the same 3D space and can inherit properties from one another. Down here I select the pull down under the master form and say duplicate. And now there's this whole new row of blocks with all the same settings as before. Since I want this one to represent the bright sporadic glints, I'll change the particle color to white. Then, in the first block, I'll go to the OBJ settings and change the mode to faces. And I'll turn that density down until it looks like just a few scattered particles. As for the shadowlets, I can go ahead and change their color to white. Then I could crank up their opacity, turn down their size, and pull the distance all the way to 0. This will all help these glints pop, even if they're in the darker areas of the object. Lastly, as a bit of housekeeping, I'm going to go ahead and click on the delete block for all of these blocks that I'm not using over here. That way, if I decide to animate them later, all of these properties will be inherited from the master form. Now let's go ahead and click apply and return to our comp. Now a quick note in case you're new to Form. In the effects window, we can manually adjust all of the settings that we just determined with the designer. From here we can set up any keyframes or animation we want and do all of our fine-tuning. I want to draw your attention to the very top tab called Show Forms. This little area shows which of the multiple forms we're adjusting. And you can see that the properties and controls below change depending on what you have selected. So just be aware of this as you start making adjustments. Now back to our comp. So we can really see what's going on, I'm going to disable my top adjustment layer with the glows, etc. At first glance, it seems darker than in the preview window. And that's because we haven't set up lights in our comp yet. I'll start by creating a spotlight, but I'm going to call it Shadow. And cool, huh? As I move this around, it looks like the light is affecting these particles. By naming this light Shadow, what it's really doing right now is affecting the direction and intensity of the shadowlets. And I'll be honest, the illusion is pretty fantastic. You can get really far with just using shadowlets. If you want the light to really be affecting these particles, we can do that too. Let's select our form layer, go to the Effect Controls window, and make sure that Master Form is enabled. Down below we can see Form's Shading tab. Let's twirl that open and see what options we have. If I look at the top of the shading controls and switch to Shading On, now the light is affecting the particles. Your first thought is probably that this looks very dark, and you instinctively want to go crank up the light like crazy. And that works, but you could also take a peek at the shading settings in Form. Form favors a more realistic lighting falloff. This nominal distance affects the falloff of the light based on distance from the light. Diffuse affects how the light is really getting propagated through the shape at large. You can also add an ambient light to the scene and dial up how much the ambient light brings up the particle color. Now just below here in the effect controls are the shadowlet settings. You can see that there are a handful of dials that influence how the light affects the shadowlet look. The color strength and opacity are pretty straightforward. Adjusting the size of the shadowlet can affect how wide each particle's shadow is spread out, and the distance is similar to turning up the distance on a drop shadow effect, moving your shadow farther away from the actual particle. Depending on your 3D model, the size of everything, where your camera is, all of these settings need to be played with each time until they create the look you're going for. I'll be making a bunch of tiny adjustments as I go along to try to achieve that sandy effect. Take it from me, when you work with children or animals and particle simulations, you really just gotta keep course correcting depending on what they give you. When I turn my adjustment layer back on, I really don't like what's happening with the glows anymore, so I'm just gonna kill them and start over on them. Because the shape is so skinny, the background is actually really blowing out and covering up the whole shape. So I'm going to fix a little bit of that by selecting the A/B colors option in the glow. This is something you can totally play with yourself and figure out the setting that's right for you. Now remember that CC light sweep effect we were playing with a while back? Well, it turns out it could really aid us in adding rim lights to this form object. Just like before, I can dial down the sweep intensity, dial up the sweep width, and play with the rim settings. Just keep in mind that it's a 2D effect as you move your camera around, but if you really finesse this and take some time, you can probably end up with a really nice pop to some of the edges of this object. I can easily add some keyframes to the rotation of this form object over time and get a kind of cool look. All of this stuff can look really cool and volumetric, especially if you want to throw in some extra lighting effect like Trapcode Shine to put some light beams through it or something. I'll be playing around with that here and there later. But this first example really goes over almost everything that I'm doing in any of these examples to create these sand sculptures. So now I'm going to do a really super basic overview of a handful of things you could do with an object like this once you had it. There are many examples within the Black Panther credits where basically they're applying a layer map straight through a 3D object to create cool patterns on top of 3D objects, or flat objects. So I can clearly show off how these layer maps work. I'm going to switch over to a layered sphere. I only need one layer and a bunch of particles. Just like before, I've tweaked all of the settings to make sure that this ball looks like a sandy surface. And now I'm going to play with applying those layer maps to it. And with Form, this is as easy as creating a pre-comp that has a really cool alpha pattern you like. Bring that into your composition, and then select it as a layer map for color and alpha. And between these options, get a really cool effect. Remember, since you're using a pre-comp, you can animate that pattern to change over time, or update it as you change your mind as to the look of your object. Layer maps could also be a really easy way to generate a cool background pattern made of particles. As I said before, the alpha channel of the layer map controls where particles appear. If I throw in a simple image like this, I can get an array of particles like this. Whether you're using a layer map to propagate through a 3D object, or using it on a flat object to create the shape itself, you already know how to create a comp like this. So why not let that power an amazing particle engine on the other side? Let's take a look at that flat pattern from before. Now say I had a cool music track that I was using in a project. I could import that music track, jump down to the audio react controls within Form, select that audio layer. I could use the amplitude of that audio to drive any of these properties. You can create 5 different reactors that respond to different properties of the sound and create all sorts of amazing things. There are some motion graphic artists that have created some astonishing things, making use of all of these properties together. Now if we step back for a second and just scroll through here, you can see just how many ways you can control this array of particles. It's amazing. And in the interest of time, there's no way I could possibly cover all of these amazing features. In fact, I tried once and it killed me. I died. I'm dead now. You can have my CDs. I find that playing around and experimenting with all of these different settings on my own is the best way to really learn. But if you're curious about any of this stuff in any real detail, Harry Frank and Chad Perkins have got your back. Check out their amazing in-depth looks into all of the features of Trapcode Form. The possibilities are really endless. But right now, I'm going to focus on trying to get my own custom OBJ models into Form to try to recreate the specific looks of some of those Black Panther shots. Now there are many online resources for downloading OBJ models. Some of them are free and some of them you can purchase. Many of the cool shots in the Black Panther main on-end credits involve human characters. Sometimes human characters who are moving and then freeze into an action pose. And while it might seem like animated characters could be a difficult resource to come by, if you have an Adobe account, you can download a free copy of Adobe Fuse Beta Edition. This is a really user-friendly program for assembling your own custom 3D character. I'm going to click on a bunch of different body parts and assemble a character for myself. Next, I'm going to export that model to Mixamo. Mixamo is Adobe's collection of motion capture files, and once I've uploaded my model to this website, I can super easily apply a whole library of different motion capture data to this model that I got for free. As soon as I find a cool animation that I like, I can export that data right back to my computer. It comes in as an animated FBX file, but Trapcode Form wants an OBJ sequence. That's basically a whole bunch of different object files that incrementally move to create the animation. If you download a free copy of Blender, you can import your FBX model. It comes in with the animation, and you can export an OBJ sequence directly from this program. If you want, you could pick any specific pose for a still frame or a still OBJ that you want to import. You could import just a head, which I do in this one case. You could go all out and save a full OBJ sequence. I tried it with this man punching. To utilize an OBJ sequence as your source for form particles, simply go to Import, find your folder with the OBJ models, and make sure After Effects is importing it as a sequence for use with particular and form. And now we can tell Form to use the OBJ sequence as its source for all the particles. Amazing, right? Obviously I had to play a lot with my particle count, the lighting positions, and adding a few extra effects. The specifics of all these will really depend on your model and how you place it. But honestly, these kind of results are phenomenal. So a super quick recap of getting animated characters into Form for free. Download Adobe Fuse, create a character, send it to Mixamo, download it to your computer. In Blender, export an OBJ sequence from your FBX file. Import those files into After Effects, And now we can tell Form to use the OBJ sequence as its source for all the particles. This really is just an amazingly fast way to get some cool geometry into your VFX shot. Let's focus on another shot I tried mimicking. I used the same pipeline as before, shopping through Mixamo until I could find a pose for a character that I really liked. I knew this character was going to be still, so I really just wanted a nice prone pose. Just like before, I exported the FBX to Blender, and then exported an OBJ from there. I just wanted the one still frame, so that's all I used in this comp. Within Form, I was able to choose an OBJ by selecting the specific 3D model I had just exported. I upped the particle count, played with the settings just like before until I was getting that sand filled in look. To create this motion background, I used one of my favorite plugins, Fractal Noise. Under Fractal Noise, you can choose to create blocky particles. And once you've done that, you can play around to modify the shape and size of these blocks. I also added in some slanting and some keyframes to the motion of this fractal, so it just looked like it was whipping by. I played with the camera and rotation of the character to create a kind of dynamic look, similar to the one in the movie. I also knew that this was a confrontation, so I ended up duplicating the model within Form. Once I had my second copy of the character, I used the transform tools to rotate and position him a little bit farther back, like a little showdown. To refine the look of the lighting on the characters, I used CC Light Sweep again, just like I had before in these other instances. In the original credits, there are these graphic lines that kind of swipe between them. I used the box strings setting, and dialed it down until it was just one laser bolt. By using glow spheres for these particles and turning their brightness all the way up, they combine really well with the comp's glow settings to create these nice light swipes. I decided to pre-render my Form layer just so I could work really quickly for the second part. Here, I wanted to try to add some dusty particles blowing by for atmosphere, and also make it look like some sand was blowing off of key spots of the character in the background. To do this all, I turned to Trapcode Particular. Once within Particular, I created one large system to blow particles across the screen. I used these smoky particles and turned up their size and down the opacity just to give some atmospheric dust blowing by. Then I ran multiple other instances of Particular, from a small emitter, emitting small particles of sand, coming off areas like the shoulder or the hip, down toward the feet. I topped these all off with Universe Camera Shake, adding a little bit of frenetic bumpiness to the shot, and then I threw in a nice camera blur at the very end to let my text pop. And here's the final result. Overall, this took about 1 hour 20. Way back in the 100% After Effects version of this effect, one of the cool things I thought about the procedural approach was that you could use a photograph as the source, and you'd get that really cool sand look. One of the very last things I'm going to show you how to do is this really cool approach to photographic elements within Form. If you've worked much with 3D software or renders, you're probably familiar with depth rendering. That's basically a form of an image where anything that is brighter is technically farther forward. These can be used for compositing elements into a 3D scene, and they're also used heavily when converting 2D movies into 3D movies. I'm going to use this amazing image of Shuri as an example. Within Photoshop, I painted a fake depth map on top of this photograph, really just guessing which parts of the image stick farther forward and which stick farther back. A little callback to that Wrinkle in Time episode, you could use this depth map as a displacement map to the original image. And check this out. Now, just like I'd said before, this is one of the main components to converting 2D movies into 3D movies. And in that same vein, we're going to convert this 2D image into a 3D particle array using Form. I now have two images that are the same dimension. One is the color photograph, and the other is that depth map. I can place those two elements down here in the scene and disable them for now. Within a new instance of Form, I'm going to create a big sheet of particles using the box array. Now, down under my layer maps, under Color and Alpha, I can select the image layer, select RGB Alpha to RGB Alpha, and have that map over XY. And check it out. Zooming all the way in, we can see that all of these particles are taking their color and their alpha from the original image. I'm going to go ahead and dial up the particle count until we get something that basically is a representation of that photo, all made of particles. If I go down and dial up the disperse effect, you can see that these are really particles all interacting in 3D space. They're fixed and I can move a camera around them and do some cool stuff. But what about that depth map? Let me show you something amazing you can do with it. Just below color and alpha in the layer maps section, there's a displacement tab. If I tell Form to use individual XYZ displacements, for the Z displacement I can choose my depth map. Just like with the image, I map it over XY. Whoops, looks like it's got to be inverted. But watch as I turn up and down the strength. Now, I was just guessing when I drew my depth map, so some things are a little bit off. In fact, I can jump back into Photoshop or in After Effects and try to play with my depth map a little bit and try to get that a little bit more refined. A better approach might have just been blurring the whole thing. But in any case, I can now use the strength of that displacement map to effectively extrude those particles until they're kind of representing the depth of the original object. We can combine this with all of our knowledge of what we can do in Form with all the different particles, including importing a music file, and perhaps linking up the displacement to the beat of this music. Maybe we'll add a little delay so it starts at the bottom and works up through the top. We could go back to that original setup and combine her with a colorful background and the blur maps and stuff like that to give this a really cool look. And heck, if you invest a little more time than the 10 minutes that I did, you could get some really detailed, amazing results. The very, very last thing I'm going to go over with you, and this is really important to me, is that you take this amazing software and run with it. Now you know how to import a 3D object and have this really cool array of particles. So why not try that with some different types of particles? Like spheres. Or cubes. In fact, Form in particular come with some really amazing sprites, and just browsing through them might open your eyes to something you've never thought of before. You could create a cat out of bubbles. Or a cat out of leaves. You could create a really cool graphic look out of giant particles. Some of the sprites are even animated, like this one for fire. You could make a whole object out of fire. You could make a dodecahedron out of fire. Then you could mix that with some stock footage or do something. Just really, there's so many things you can do. Don't stop at just making sandy looking things. Play with Form to create some really unique 3D objects. I promise just playing around with it for half a day will get you some results that you had never even imagined beforehand.
Whew, that was a lot of stuff. But once I get going, I just really can't thank you so much for hanging out with me and learning all about sand. As we make our way through these tutorials, I really hope that you guys come out the other side with some skills you never had before. Because remember that mimicking these effects is a great learning experience, but don't stop there. I believe that you can do great things. And it never hurts to have a few cheap tricks up your sleeve. Man, I really enjoyed Black Panther. I think things are really looking up for that whole Marvel gang. Oh yeah? Oh. Oh. Yeah, maybe we should cover Infinity War next time.